welcome you here for those in the room and also for all of you guys watching the panel online. I'm going to hand over the floor to Alistair Dutton in just a sec to kick off today's program. For those in the room, I just wanted to let you know that while it was officially that you can actually have your masks off in the room this size whilst seated, the COP organisers have actually suggested that you keep your masks on for the moment. So please, you can choose whether what to do, but we would recommend that you try to keep the masks on for the moment. Maybe the panelists are fine. You guys can choose what you want to do. For those watching online, please remember to send any questions that you have, and we will take those from the floor at that particular time. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Alistair Dutton to provide the welcoming remarks. Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Welcome. You've got the best till last, as they always say, and floating wind is really, really special. Just a couple of moments before I bring up the panel, but for me, so I chair the Global Offshore Wind Task Force for GWEC, and floating to me is fascinating. 3-4 years ago, you'd talk about it and people go, yeah, something in the future. Now it's red hot, and back end of this decade is going to get even hotter. At which point we expand the opportunity for offshore wind by roughly 5 times as many places that we can go, and certain countries are just waiting for it to come. In fact, we've just had a great conversation with South Africa, who are ready for when that point appears. They've got spectacular wind. Enough from me. Let me ask the panel to come on up. I will ask the panel to introduce themselves and just give about 3 minutes what their interest in floating wind is. Should just say, originally this session was planned for around an hour. We're going to do it for 45 minutes, partly because of the time of day, partly because the air in the room, and we're all a little exhausted. So if we might start with Ben.
Hi, thanks, Alistair. So I'm Ben Hunt. I'm I run corporate affairs for Siemens Gamesa, and I think our interest in offshore floating wind is probably fairly obvious. We're the world's largest manufacturer of offshore turbines, and we see this as obviously a fantastic long-term market opportunity. And just to give some colour to what Alistair said about South Africa, for example, South Africa's offshore wind capacity on the slide that he just showed a member of the Presidential Climate Commission is 901 gigawatts, and only 49 gigawatts of those, I think, would be fixed foundation. So, for a company in the business of manufacturing offshore wind turbines, you can see what the market means to us. Yeah.
Very good. Sian?
So I'm Sian Lloyd-Rees. I'm the UK MD for Aker Offshore Wind. And what is my interest? I've been involved in floating foundations all my career in different industries. And so to see it moving forward now in wind at a pace and a scale, it's just exciting. And I think also, if you look at floating wind and you look at the scale of the wind that is in deep water, it can really help us to achieve those climate targets that we've set as well.
Hi, and I'm Alex Grant. I do business development for Equinor, but my other role is UK country manager, and that covers the scope of Equinor's businesses in the UK, from offshore wind fixed, so currently building Dogger Bank and have a couple of other projects, Sheringham Shoal and Dudgeon, in operation, through to hydrogen with the East Coast Cluster project, where we have carbon capture and storage offshore and hydrogen plans using that carbon capture through to the oil and gas, but of course then the floating offshore as well. And Equinor in the North Sea for floating offshore. We compete with Aaron for who's got the world's biggest floating offshore plant, and it kind of moves as we develop. So we had the first, and then I think you overtook us, and then we had Hywind Scotland, which was the biggest until a couple of weeks ago. And now from next year, we'll have 88 megawatts with Hywind Tampen on the Norwegian side, which will then overtake you again, Aaron.
Yeah, it's been a healthy competition. So my name is Aaron Smith. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Principal Power. We are a floating offshore wind technology developer behind the WindFloat concept, That's a 3-column semi-submersible floating platform that can be deployed in water depths up to well over 1,000 meters, which dramatically increases the areas where you can deploy offshore wind worldwide. And that's really exciting for us because what it means is you can have offshore wind, which has historically been a pretty regional industry. So far, the growth has really been in Europe and China and a little bit in the US and Taiwan, and make it a global industry. It really democratizes floating offshore wind by basically bringing this vast resource to any coastal nation that has a population center and load, allowing you to chase the best wind resources and bringing down the cost of energy.
Thank you very much. I've got some questions. I'll then invite the audience if they've got any questions, and we've got virtual questions expected to come in as well. But just to start us off with, nice easy one for you. In which markets do you expect floating offshore wind to have the greatest impact?
So to begin with, we think that floating offshore wind is going to have a really high impact in markets that have a combination of good wind resource, load that is in the coastal area, somewhat constrained ability to build onshore renewables. And we see that from a kind of market perspective, Southeast Asia really beats that policy mix. There are places in Europe, particularly here in Scotland, where the government is moving forward with a massive leasing round to award capacity. But what's really important for this mix is that we need the right enabling policy and regulation to enable developers like my colleagues up here to actually get the right to develop the sites and then bring them to the market. And so we think that the countries that move the most quickly towards establishing those enabling conditions are the one where the floating offshore wind industry will take off most quickly, and they'll be the ones that really gain the benefits around the economic impacts of this industry.
And Sean, maybe you'd like to build on that and name some your hot countries.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, if we even just start from an industry perspective, if you look at the IEA's report, I think it's the majority of the good offshore wind sits in the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly around island locations, which makes the UK a great place to be. Likewise, countries that have very ambitious emissions reduction targets is a good place where we can bring it straight into the grid. So for us, those are the areas that we are focusing on in particular at the moment. Europe is particularly attractive to us, Norway, the UK, the North Sea has some excellent wind, but of course also so does Japan and South Korea. So I think you'll see different countries adopt different regimes and different speeds actually in moving forward. And I was on a panel yesterday where solar is really a huge thing for Australia. So I think each of us will find our particular route. But for us, it would be the UK and Europe.
And Ben, we've heard about government support, but that can come in different ways. So what government support is required to facilitate global build out of commercial scale floating wind?
Well, I think from a turbine manufacturer perspective, there's not a tremendous amount of difference between building a turbine for fixed foundation to offshore foundation, but clearly there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place, to enable the build out. Particularly, I understand that ports are a particular problem. I had a very long conversation with a naval architect from Glasgow last night who was explaining to me why it's so difficult. And even Scotland, with its vast sort of coastal resource, has got a port problem. So there is that, but it's exactly the same. We need from government the same as we need for regular offshore wind, which is a consistent, reliable roadmap for deployment, and we need them to speed up the process of getting from having a site to deploying our technology.
And Alex, build on that. Are there any things that you're particularly looking for, and any countries that are particularly good at it?
There's not really much I can build on there, actually. I think that is what it's about now. It's not about pilots anymore. The technology is tested. It's about scaling, and scaling is one of the big things that will bring down the cost. From our first pilot project in high wind, 3.6 megs, to our high wind Tampen that come on next year at 88 megs. I think we'll have reduced costs per kilowatt hour by over 100%. So half them. Now they need to half again, and a big part of that is scale. So it's about the regulatory structures and the predictability that there will be more to do, and there are targets that people are committed to, that when you're building those spreadsheets and predicting how well it will get, you can put confidence that the rules won't change on you as you progress. And that, in some ways, is more important than there's plenty of wind out there when you go offshore, and you can float and find the best wind. There's a lot of it. I think 4 or 5 times as much floating potential as there is fixed. It's about those regulatory structures and being able to see that in the future you will be able to scale.
Go for it.
And just maybe one thing to build on Alex's point. I mean, timing in this industry is such a challenge. You guys installed your first floating wind turbine in 2009. We installed our first one in 2011. Fast forward 10 years and the overall global capacity is still less than 100 megawatts. The technology is really ready right now. There is an urgency to deploying more wind. I mean, the net zero scenarios are suggesting that we need to build wind capacity from about 700 gigawatts now to over 8,000 gigawatts. A lot of that is going to have to be done in the ocean. If we want to meet our climate targets, we really need to have policy that recognizes this degree of urgency. So we saw a lot of encouraging things this morning about marine spatial planning and the different efforts to put roadmaps out in place, but we need to see more, and we need the climate emergency to be featured as an urgent topic.
Very good. Nice segue into my next question. So you spoke at the overall wind industry level, but why is accelerating the commercialization of floating offshore wind so crucial to help the world achieve net zero? So Sean, do you want to speak to this floating wind component of that?
Sorry, the question exactly is, why is floating?
Why is accelerating the commercialization of floating offshore wind so crucial to help the world achieve net zero?
Okay, well, I think, and again, I touched on it in my previous answer. If we actually look at, so about 80% of the world's offshore wind sits in water depths greater than 60 meters, up to 2,000 meters. So it is a floating play as we go forward. But that level of offshore wind, should we be able to capture it affordably for the consumer, then it could actually deliver 11 times global power demand. So it's clearly a huge opportunity for us, particularly in the areas where we can do it cost effectively, energy efficiently, and work also to build that whole infrastructure locally so that the country benefits from that too.
Very good. More specific question around small island developing states. I'll put that to you, Aaron. Yeah, floating wind looks like it could help these SIDS. Do you think that could be practical, the idea of actually towing complete floating turbines to them?
I think it's kind of a island by island question, but we do see developments in a number of different islands, particularly in the larger islands like Japan, countries like this that lack the ability to have indigenous resource for energy in general, whether it's fossil or renewable. Offshore wind is offering a tremendous indigenous resource that allows them to get off foreign fossil fuels, and they already have their kind of own industrial base, their own ports, and so very capable of moving quite quickly. There are other examples of island nations that are maybe a bit smaller, a bit less local industry. Floating offshore wind offers the same benefits, but sometimes there may be some more technical challenges that need to be overcome related to the maturity of the infrastructure. That being said, I do think that each situation is worth evaluating and trying to see to chart a roadmap to net zero for each country that recognizes the local conditions.
Just one thing, going back to the net zero question that I think is important for floating wind. In a net zero overall, one of the issues is people want to use energy when they want to use energy. And of course, one of the problems with wind is the energy is produced when the wind wants to blow. And that in a whole system, there's a lot of ways we need to solve that. One, of course, is on the demand side. So energy demand is moderated, and building strategies and things like that. That is key to try and moderate that demand side. But the other is to have a mix of renewable sources. And the thing about floating offshore is it has a different profile to fixed. Further out, there are different wind patterns. The capacity on high wind Scotland, for example, is 57% versus 40 odd for and it's not just that the capacity is higher, it's also got a different pattern. So if you bring in these different load factors and you can bring it in at scale, it's also moderating it. So you don't, if we just built offshore wind, we'd have an exacerbation of what we've got at the moment in the UK, at least, which is we see more and more negative pricing days. We need to try and find green supply for the other parts that we're not filling. And that's where not just floating offshore, but floating offshore at scale, also solar, of course. I wish we had a bit more sun, although it's been good this week, where the other parts do have more value.
Thank you. I'm going to leap in a slightly different direction. So this is one for you, Sean. The energy transition must be a just one. How can we draw on the knowledge and experience of the oil and gas sector to tap into deeper waters?
Okay, so this is a pet subject, so it could take a while, but I'll just try and summarize it. If you actually look at offshore floating wind, it needs the floating foundations. If you look at carbon capture, it's all about technology and onshore delivery that's been done out of oil and gas. You look at hydrogen, it's the same as gas management. So I would argue actually that for the energy transition, we actually need the skills of the oil and gas supply chain. They have the history of understanding how to optimize floating foundations, how to develop things subsea, etc. So for me, that skill set is a huge part of how we can accelerate and actually move more quickly in the UK than maybe we could if we tried to do it from scratch, or we adopted the same approach that we've taken from fixed bottom and tried to take that to floating offshore wind. So my first point is I think they're key, absolutely key in it. In terms of the just transition, what I also think is important is that the technology is the same. And when you actually start to look at the floating wind going into deeper waters, clearly the structures get much bigger. But what's interesting is the percentage of cost of the turbine gets less and the percentage cost of the floating foundation gets higher. So the optimization of that floating foundation becomes really important. And this is where the oil and gas, we keep pushing back on the oil and gas that they've done bespoke one-offs. This is mass production. But optimization and standardization, it's a technology play. We need to do that before we go into mass production. So I think the oil and gas industry is key there. But we do need to engage early. There are changes, there are differences. So we need to engage with the developers, need to engage with the supply chain and help to support the establishment of the infrastructure and the capabilities in country. We've seen some countries do it really well, actually. Denmark is a very good example of it, where they brought the supply chain together with the developers together with an industrial strategy. And I think we haven't quite got there in the UK yet. So for me, this is an area to look at in the same way as ports. If you actually look at the function of ports going forward, huge employers in places like Rotterdam and Amsterdam, if we actually look at their function as being a distribution point for an integrated energy mix, you're really talking about a different starting point for building industrial strength and supply chain strength in a country. So I think it's really important that we get this right at the beginning.
Alex, I'm sure you've got something to say on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree again. I mean, these are massive projects now, but Dogger Bank is 2.4 gigawatts, the first two phases, 1.2 gigawatts after. They're huge multi-year projects, massive amounts of spend, a big project management. And that is a skill set and a mindset that the majors have, oil and gas majors. And the people that are doing it for Equinor used to be facilities manager on Mariner or subsurface, and now they are the facilities manager or looking at some part of Dogger Bank as an example. So they're the same skills, the same mindset. And then if you think about, I shouldn't make too many analogies to oil and gas, but if you think about how oil and gas started, it was on the onshore, it was the easy stuff, and then we found there were bigger accumulations in offshore in shallow water, and we worked out how to do that. And then we found out there were bigger accumulations in the deep water. We worked out how to do that. And there is a bit of a similarity here with wind. There's onshore wind and the project gets bigger in the shallow water. And now we're going for the big projects, but scale is going to be really important. We can't do small floating offshore wind projects. They need to be big to get the cost down, and they're big project management challenges.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm just going to pause to see if there are any questions from the audience. We have one there. Can we get a microphone there? I was going to hold mine in front of you. I may do that.
But we need to sanitize.
No, not to give it to you, just speak it.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you very much. So I have a very specific question. how do we tackle social resistance? And I would like an opposition from the local communities. And I would like to give you an example. In my country, in Greece, we have a huge potential in offshore wind, not just for our own needs, but also to export on behalf of the rest of the Europe to Asia and Africa because of our geographically position. But we are facing opposition from the local communities. So I have two questions. How do we convince the local communities to go towards these investments? And if actually into numbers do affect the investment cost? I mean, when someone wants to invest in the environment that it's not safe and it's not stable, do these affect also the investment? I mean, in terms of money? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You'd like to take that one?
I can start if you like.
Please.
It's a difficult question. The analogy I'd give, or the experience I give, is in the UK and Norfolk. Whereas where I go on holiday most summers, and as part of that, I do my own little unscientific survey, which is ask the local fisherman that's taking me out or what they think of the wind farms. And I think there's a few different parts to it. The first is, in terms of the wind farms being sited, which is a big fear, that seems to be less than it used to be. People have got used to them far out, just like people are used to pylons or whatever it may be, but they've had to happen for people to get used to it. At the start, that was a big resistance. Of course, with floating, even further out, you can't even see them. But the big challenge is bringing the cables back to shore. And that's where, as an industry, we have to be responsible, because if everyone just does their own thing and we're digging up a lot of ground for each individual one, rather than in some way coming together, yes, there will need to be some onshore works to get the electricity back on shore. But if we can combine and work together as separate projects and say, hey, we can do these three together rather than one, and we can plan the building, kind of like, rather when your road's been dug up 3 times in the same week for the electrics, and it gets a bit annoying. But if they can dig the same hole and do all 3 at the same time, then it's hopefully better. So, but I think and of course it's constant stakeholder outreach and educate people and hold local sessions, go through, explain what it is. But any new industry, it's not easy. You have to work at it.
Can I add something to that? I think it's also about thinking, trying to think as the community thinks. So quite frankly, the stakeholder engagement is really important. So for a community, what's important is that it creates jobs or wealth in their area, that their considerations for how these things are placed are taken into account. And if you look at the wind industry in the UK so far, I'll just use that as one example. You've seen the structures come from overseas and just come in and be there. The wealth hasn't generated jobs and wealth in the local community. So I think if we want to be successful going forward, this is my whole piece about the stakeholder engagement, making people understand, what does this mean for you in your community? What does it mean for jobs, which is a huge concern to people, after the pandemic, et cetera, as we go forward. So I think it's about really embracing that approach and understanding it, as opposed to maybe a little bit more of a lip service that could have been paid, in some instances, is the feedback that we get. So I think there will be a lot more community and stakeholder engagement now going forward, as well as everything that you've said about being very conscious and sensitive to, particularly in Norfolk, where a huge number of retired legal people live. So they have a very strong view actually on what happens on their coastline.
I had a lovely conversation with a Scotsman a few days ago. I wish I could remember who it was, but there have been so many conversations. He said, I've got a crotchety old uncle who lives in a remote island in the very north of Scotland. And he said, I remember when they brought electricity here first and nobody wanted that. And then I remember when they brought the telephone lines in and nobody wanted those. And now nobody wants to be able to see offshore turbines from their houses, but within 5 years they'll have forgotten that they didn't want to see them from their houses. And I had a really interesting experience visiting an RWE wind farm on the south coast of England, which is going to the points that have already been made about sort of sensitivity and people getting used to it. The biggest concern that they had was that they were going to have to run the cables through an area of outstanding natural beauty called the South Downs. And it was done with such sensitivity, and that within a couple of years you couldn't see that they'd even been through. And so they have a wind farm now which is visible from Brighton, which the people actually feel an attachment to. It's their wind farm, right? And they can see the energy transition going on. Now they have a problem. They want to put taller turbines up closer to retired lawyer communities a little bit further down the coast. And so now the process starts of kind of trying to convince those people that it's not going to be a problem. I think one of the big effects of COP, I hope, is that people get 2 weeks of education through the media about why this is necessary. And we've had 18 months in which COVID has been the sort of dominant the dominant story. Now we have 2 weeks in which climate change is the dominant story, and something has to give, right? And I remember the head of the Danish Wind Energy Association saying a couple of years ago in Copenhagen, if by 2030 we cannot all see evidence of the transition, the energy transition from our homes, we will have failed. And so we're all going to have to live with it.
Thank you very much. Moving on to a slightly different topic that associated is, and I'm going to put this to yourself, Erin. What are some of the environmental challenges associated with floating offshore wind turbines, and particularly any gaps in scientific data?
I mean, I think to start with, there's really an environmental opportunity with floating offshore wind in that you can kind of decouple the structure from the seabed and really deconflict where these are sited. So you can site these responsibly as far as possible out of conflict with sensitive areas or areas of competing use. And that's really the first step. You want to make sure your wind farm is sited as responsibly as possible, because we're all in this industry environmentalists. We want the projects to have net positive environmental impact. From there, I mean, I think, we spend a lot of time as an industry on an individual project basis going out and collecting data about what the baseline conditions are at each site. So yes, there are gaps in our data sets, but we do, as part of environmental impact assessment processes, go out and really make sure we understand what's there and how we can protect it, how we can preserve it. And then I think the industry is also taking steps to really try to understand how these structures can actually deliver a net positive to the environment as well by, for example, conducting research about how the structures can serve as artificial reefs and perhaps increase the biodiversity within wind farms, how we can use the offshore wind farm areas in a way that is denser use of space that can support multiple aspects that are useful for the environment and climate. So my view here is that you have to develop projects very carefully, very deliberately to avoid these, but you collect the data on a project by project basis, so those gaps are easily filled.
Okay, and Sean, giving the oil and gas experience as well, there's some concern I've heard that marine mammals and anchor lines could be potentially a new issue for us. Is there learning from oil and gas on that?
I think that's been an area that we've had to focus and study on for years in terms of all the pipelines. So there's a wealth of data on that, actually, and I think possibly too what the wind industry can learn from the oil and gas industry is we started to look at that marine spatial on a regional basis. So you start to look at the patterns for where they migrate, and it gives you a more holistic way of being able to plan where all of the structures are, so that you have the least effect on them. And it's just time gathering data. We use many more digital tools. We talk a lot now about using digital tools in offshore floating wind as it goes forward. And we talk about the need for this to scale up. We've been doing that for years in oil and gas as well, particularly on the ops and maintenance. So there's a wealth of data as a starting point from there. It's well studied, and it's a concern to many.
Very good. We've got some questions coming in virtually, and I'm going to pop this one to you, Ben. You're calling for scale, but can the supply chain develop at scale?
Yes, that's the that's the multi-billion euro question. I mean, I think my CEO is on the record saying a few years ago, I don't really need floating. My order book is full. I have all the offshore turbines I can make at the moment. Yes, there will need to be a dramatic change somewhere, because we are talking about a colossal number of turbines, and at the moment, I think about our industrial footprint around the North Sea, and just to meet existing capacity, we're opening a new factory in France, a new factory in the United States. We're expanding Hull, all of which requires huge upfront capital investment from us and from government. And if we are going to add, X gigawatts, for floating as well by the end of this decade, then clearly further investment is going to be required. And as said on a panel earlier this week, that the value chain at the moment in the industry does not support us making unlimited investment in sort of new supply chain infrastructure from our perspective, and our suppliers would be in a very similar situation.
And Aaron, in terms of the foundations, can they be built fast enough at scale?
We believe that they can. We believe the first step is making sure that we have the right sort of policy signals. So that involves sites that can be developed according to a timeline that is short enough that you can go to your industrial base and suppliers and really start working on how you're going to deliver these. It also requires coordination with policymakers and ports and infrastructure, especially to make sure that those critical assets, because you do a lot of the construction of floating offshore wind farms within ports, and then you float them to the sites where they're connected to anchors that hold the position of the units for their 25-year lives. You really need to make sure that those port facilities are ready. And in many cases, those have their own kind of timelines. And if you don't get the ports right in the country, then there's really no way to get the supply chain there in a full way. So this is I think everybody on this panel would agree, this is an industry creation project on the scale of which we haven't seen in many, many decades. It requires very careful coordination between the different stakeholders, in particular, policymakers, supply chain developers, and then all the environmental and NGO stakeholders to get it right. And so we really welcome the work that GWEC especially does to enable those conversations.
Thank you. And another question from our virtual audience. This one's for you, Alex. Will hydrogen help or hinder the rollout of floating offshore wind?
I don't think it will hinder. Will it help? I think it's more about what I came back to before of helping that overall net zero goal. In the job I've been in, one of the things I've come under a lot of criticism for, you won't be surprised, especially here, is, dirty production of gas, and you should be producing less gas. In the last couple of weeks, the pressure from government has been, why aren't you producing more gas? Because people are, and I think one thing that, in the triangle of energy security, of energy concerns, decarbonization, energy security, and cost. And for the last 2 or 3 years, decarbonization has been at the top, and that's great. In the last month or so, cost and energy security of supply have suddenly risen up. And there's lots of reasons given for that. And, we didn't predict it. And so picking what reason it is. But one of the things that we're pretty sure, or that we are convinced it's not, is the argument about it's because of offshore wind and the wind not blowing enough. We need more offshore wind. We need more floating offshore wind. What hasn't kept up while all of this decarbonized, inflexible supply has come is decarbonized, flexible supply. And that's what needs to accelerate to meet the other. Floating offshore is a little bit of that. It's not flexible, but it has a different load curve. Hydrogen, of course, decarbonized hydrogen is that flexibility. It's its value as a decarbonized battery. That is where, and if that progresses, that is what needs to happen. And that will allow offshore wind and floating offshore wind to progress further without us getting these bumps in the road that we may have, which we fear may slow down the transition if people start worrying more about the lights going off and how to pay their bills rather than the climate. And so that is why hydrogen is important as a flexible piece, and that will help, we believe, the accelerated propagation of what we need on the wind side.
John, you've got to add to that. Come on.
I would like to add to that a little bit, because I agree with what Alex has said. But also, as I stated earlier, I think the majority of good offshore wind sits around island populations where the demand is low. So if we want to capture this demand and take it to where the global demand is highest, we do need to be able to convert it from wind to other products, hydrogen being a good vector, either as an intermediate or as the end product, to enable us to do that. So we talked yesterday about a project, the Northern Horizons project, offshore Shetlands, where we look to take 10 gigawatts of offshore floating wind, convert it to 5 gigawatts offshore of hydrogen, but then onwards to methane, which is very easily exportable, which is a growing market globally and can be shipped anywhere. So I think there's two values to that. You're starting to actually be able to grow the whole decarbonization of multiple industries at the same time, not just power and the electricity. And secondly, you are starting to be able to build wealth and community employment into these areas where traditionally the energy demand is not high. So I see hydrogen, integrated energy, I see as absolutely the future in terms of how we achieve our climate targets globally.
Okay, we've also got another question which ask a couple of you to answer. We'll go with Aaron first. What do each of the panelists see as the biggest marine spatial planning challenge specific for offshore wind? Doesn't say floating, but could I add the word floating in? The biggest marine spatial planning challenge specific for floating offshore wind.
I think that our experience so far has been that the relationship with the fishing industries has been the biggest challenge, kind of generally extrapolated across all markets that we've been in. I think it's a very emotional subject because fisheries have in the past had the full flexibility to go out and pursue their activities anywhere in the ocean. We're looking at putting assets in the ocean that are going to be there in fixed position for 25 plus years. There will be some types of fishing that you're not able to do within the boundaries of the wind farm because we have power cables, we have mooring chains, and they could create risks of entanglement and things like this that would be hazards to safety. And so how do we get beyond this challenge? I mean, for us, it's very much again, it goes back to siting things responsibly, making sure we have the data to understand where the most productive fishing areas are and avoiding those, making sure that we're in dialogue with the fisheries from a very early stage to understand how we can create alternative lines of business or revenue for themselves and their future generations of coastal communities. And then also making sure that if there are areas where we are going to disrupt their business and we're not able to avoid it, that we do think about how to compensate that.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to give your
it's a fairly basic answer, which I apologize up front, but I think one of the things about floating versus fixed is there's more choice. So there's more room to compromise where there are difficulties, again, coming with fishing, etc. There's a bit more flexibility compared to where, what is the seabed like for fixed. So that's one of the big advantages. On the flip side, with fixed, it's into the ground. Here we'll have anchors that come out. So the area around each one is wider. Which provides more difficulty. So there's pros and cons, and just second what Aaron said, which is then it's about working through and making sure that compromises are found and the studies are done. And what we must make sure we don't do is we need to go apace, but not roll over considerations, and that goes to all of the studies, all of the stakeholder outreach, because otherwise we'll end up in the long term slowing our business down if we don't get the support, not just of public, but of industry that shares the sea with us.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Hold the microphone for you.
So if I could just return to the topic that was brought up a little bit earlier in terms of a just transition. I think that moving to renewable energies like wind is incredibly important. But you had mentioned that there were some communities where demand is low, but it is the best, sites for certain types of offshore wind. What is the process for making sure that those communities who are hosting these, sites are whether it's compensated or just generally benefiting from those beyond the kind of reduced emissions But in particular, how are they benefiting from hosting these, especially where it might interfere with some of their industries like fishing or their indigenous waters or things like that. If I could get your thoughts.
Thank you. Sean, do you want to take that first?
Oh, yeah, I'll add a bit to it. So the just transition is very much a term that's used in Scotland and in the UK, they use levelling up, but it's the same principle in terms of it. But if I just stick with just transition for a moment. So the recent wind leasing round that's come out, ScotWind, that people are bidding for, an important factor of that is your supply chain development statement. So it's a really important component to put in. How much will you build locally? What will you do for that community? How much funding will you put in it? And then, of course, for those that are successful in winning lease sites, you have to then over the next year firm that ambition up into a commitment. And then the government will measure you as you actually achieve and deliver on it. So I think we are starting to see now a lot more organization and thought going into how do we make the local communities, benefit from it. I talked about that example in Shetlands, for example. Well, you would have your net zero refinery on Shetland, and you would also have, a lot of the actual port activity on Shetland as well. But from a just transition perspective now, we are seeing industry, the wind developers, supply chain and private investors start to work together and be held accountable to a plan that you actually are putting in with your lease site as well. So I do see it making progress.
Anybody else like to pick up on it? Go for it.
Sure. From an environmental perspective, I mean, I think the example that I'd bring into it is Korea. So we were originally developing floating offshore wind projects in Korea because we saw that there's a huge amount of demand on the EC, and the wind speeds there are really about 2 meters per second more than you see in the shallow water sites on the west coast of Korea, where you have the potential to deploy fixed bottom. So we thought there was kind of a natural economic advantage of floating offshore wind, which made it a really compelling market. But a lot of the demand from the government, and the reason why the government is so keen, and they've got a target of 13 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 now, is that they were looking directly to offset the particulates that are coming from existing fossil fire generation, because the air quality in Korea is really, really bad and it is politically unpopular. So what we see the opportunity is for floating offshore wind. I mean, the project we have under development there with Aker Offshore Wind and Ocean Winds, it's 75 kilometers from the coast, so it's far out of sight. It's deconflicted from where the fisheries want us, and it's going to pipe clean, renewable power back to the coastal communities while providing years and years of work to the various shipyards there. So it's really an economic win-win, and it has these environmental benefits as well.
Thank you. And we've got another question in from our virtual audience. I'll put this to you if you may first, Alex. Do you believe that floating offshore wind can achieve cost parity with fixed bottom? Question mark. If so, what needs to happen for this to be the case?
So first of all, yes, I do. What needs to happen? A few things. The main one is scale. I think I've already mentioned, so I'm repeating myself, but between first project and third project, we've gone from 3.6 now to the third project to 88 megawatts. And in that first to second, which was 3.6 to 20 odd, we reduced by 40% levelized cost of energy. From that one to the next one, which comes on stream next year, another 70% is our prediction. We've just got to keep going with that. I mean, our next plan is 500 megawatt floating offshore, a gigawatt floating offshore. That will make the cost come down. And then as the supply chain develops, and there is something that could make them be a big advantage. I mean, you don't need to put something into the ground. And the thing about the ground of the sea is it's different in different places, and you have to do engineering to work it out, like building foundations in a house. It depends where your house is situated, and not all are the same. With floating, the potential for standardization, albeit, wind speeds are different and seas are different, is very much there. So getting that sort of supply chain running, and we really believe that the costs can come down with scale. In a year, I think our official quote is mid-2030s is our prediction.
Very good. We're up at time, so we're going to cut it there. I'm sure we could talk a lot more about all of this, but very positive tone I'm hearing from the panel. I'd like to thank the audience for coming and for your questions, and from our virtual audience too. It's time to go make a cup of tea.